Marcus Chen had been traveling through Europe for 3 months when he finally reached London. The 25-year-old software engineer from San Francisco carried his backpack through the crowded streets of Westminster, camera hanging around his neck like every other tourist. He had seen the Eiffel Tower, walked through Rome's ancient streets, and marveled at Barcelona's architecture. But London felt different somehow, heavier with history that seemed to whisper from every corner. The morning was crisp and gray when Marcus joined the small crowd gathered outside Buckingham Palace. He had heard about the changing of the guard ceremony, but never imagined he would witness it firsthand. The tourists around him chattered excitedly in various languages, phones and cameras ready to capture the spectacle. Marcus found himself squeezed between a family from Japan and an elderly couple speaking German. As the ceremony began, the red-coated guards marched with perfect precision. Their movements were sharp and deliberate, boots striking the pavement in perfect unison. Marcus raised his camera, but something made him pause. One guard in particular caught his attention. He was young, probably close to Marcus's own age, with stern features and eyes that stared straight ahead with unwavering focus. The tourist next to Marcus, an American woman in her 50s, began making jokes about the guards' tall black hats. She laughed loudly and pointed, trying to get one of them to crack a smile. "Come on, just a little smirk," she called out, waving her phone to record their reaction. The guard remained motionless, his expression unchanged. Marcus watched as more tourists joined in, treating the ceremony like entertainment rather than the solemn tradition it represented. They made faces, told jokes, and even threw small objects hoping for a reaction. The young guard Marcus had noticed earlier stood perfectly still, his rifle held at attention, eyes fixed on some distant point that only he could see. Something about the guard's stillness began to affect Marcus deeply. Here was someone his own age, standing with such dignity and purpose while being mocked by strangers. The guard's silence wasn't weakness or inability to respond. It was strength, discipline, and respect for something far greater than himself. As the ceremony continued, Marcus lowered his camera completely. He found himself studying the guard's face, seeing past the uniform to the person underneath. There was something profound in that unwavering stance, something that spoke of duty, honor, and sacrifice that Marcus had never encountered in his comfortable life back home. The crowd began to thin as the ceremony concluded, but Marcus remained. He watched as the guards maintained their positions even after most tourists had left. The young guard he had been observing continued to stand perfectly still, as if he were carved from stone. Yet there was life in his eyes, a deep commitment that transcended the mockery and disrespect he had endured. Marcus realized he was witnessing something rare in his generation. Here was someone who understood what it meant to serve something greater than personal comfort or individual desires. The guard's silence spoke louder than any words could. It carried the weight of centuries of tradition, of men who had stood in similar positions through wars, celebrations, and the changing of times. A light rain began to fall, but the guard didn't flinch. Tourists hurried for cover, but this young man remained steadfast. Marcus felt a strange emotion rising in his chest, something between admiration and shame. He thought about his own life, his complaints about work deadlines, his frustration with slow internet, his annoyance at minor inconveniences that now seemed trivial. Standing there in the London drizzle, watching this anonymous guard maintain his post with such dignity, Marcus began to understand that he was witnessing something sacred. The weight of British tradition, carried by one young man's unwavering commitment, was more powerful than any tourist attraction he had ever seen. The guard's silence contained centuries of history, sacrifice, and honor that words could never adequately express. Hours passed, but Marcus couldn't bring himself to leave. The rain had stopped, and new groups of tourists arrived for the next ceremony. He watched from a distance as the same pattern repeated. Visitors would arrive with cameras and expectations, treat the guards as photo opportunities, and leave without understanding what they had witnessed. The young guard, however, remained constant. His name tag read Williams, and Marcus found himself wondering about the person behind the uniform. What had brought him here? What thoughts occupied his mind during these long hours of silence? Did he have family, dreams, fears like everyone else? Marcus decided to stay until Williams's shift ended. He bought coffee from a nearby vendor and settled on a bench where he could observe without being intrusive. As the afternoon wore on, he began to notice details that other tourists missed. The slight adjustment Williams made when his feet grew tired, the way his eyes tracked movement without his head turning, the almost imperceptible deepening of his breathing during moments of particular chaos. A group of teenagers arrived, louder and more disruptive than the earlier crowds. They dared each other to get closer to the guards to try making them laugh or react. One boy, probably 17, approached Williams directly. He made faces, told jokes, even did a small dance. Williams remained perfectly still, but Marcus caught something in his eyes, not annoyance or anger, but a kind of patient endurance that spoke of deep inner strength. The teenager grew more aggressive, frustrated by the lack of response. He began making personal comments, trying to provoke a reaction through insults. Marcus felt his own anger rising, but Williams showed nothing. His breathing remained steady, his posture unchanged, yet somehow his very stillness seemed to create a barrier that the teenager couldn't cross. Eventually, the boy's friends pulled him away, bored by the lack of reaction. Marcus watched Williams carefully, looking for any sign that the encounter had affected him. But there was nothing, no relief, no tension, no acknowledgement that anything had happened at all. It was as if Williams existed in a different realm, one where petty provocations couldn't reach him. An elderly British gentleman approached Marcus on the bench. "First time seeing the guards?" he asked kindly, noticing Marcus's prolonged attention. "Yes," Marcus replied. "I've been here for hours. There's something about them, about him specifically." He nodded toward Williams. The old man smiled knowingly. "My grandson serves in the same regiment. Been in the family for 4 generations now. These young men, they understand something most people don't. They know that some things are worth protecting even when others don't understand or appreciate it." Marcus nodded, still watching Williams. "How do they do it? Stand there while people mock them, treat them like statues?" "Training, certainly," the gentleman said. "But more than that, it's belief. They believe in something bigger than themselves. The monarchy, the country, the tradition, it all becomes part of them. When you truly serve something greater, individual insults become meaningless." As evening approached, Marcus saw Williams' replacement approaching. The changing of the guard happened with the same precision he had witnessed that morning, but now Marcus understood it differently. This wasn't just a ceremony or tourist attraction. It was a sacred trust being passed from one person to another, a continuous chain of service that stretched back through centuries. Williams marched away with his fellow guards, his duty completed for the day. Marcus wanted to follow, to somehow thank him or acknowledge what he had witnessed, but he understood that would be inappropriate. The guard's power lay partially in his anonymity, in his willingness to serve without recognition or praise. Walking back to his hotel that evening, Marcus carried with him a new understanding of strength. He had always thought strength meant speaking up, fighting back, asserting oneself. But Williams had shown him a different kind of strength, one that came from absolute commitment to duty, from placing service above self, from understanding that some things were worth protecting even when others couldn't see their value. The weight of British tradition that Marcus had felt that morning was becoming clearer to him. It wasn't just about pageantry or tourism. It was about young people like Williams choosing to dedicate their lives to something timeless, something that connected them to generations of service and sacrifice that most people would never understand or appreciate. Marcus returned to the palace the next morning, drawn by something he couldn't fully explain. Williams was there again, standing at his post with the same unwavering dedication. This time Marcus brought a small notebook and began writing down his observations, trying to capture not just what he saw but what he felt. The morning crowd was different, school children on an educational tour. Their teacher tried to explain the historical significance of the guards, but the children were more interested in the spectacle than the substance. They giggled and pointed, treating Williams and his fellow guards as living mannequins rather than real people performing a real duty. One little girl, perhaps 8 years old, broke away from her group and walked directly toward Williams. Unlike the teenagers from the day before, she approached with genuine curiosity rather than mockery. She stood in front of him, tilting her head to study his face with the innocent directness only children possess. "Why don't you smile?" she asked quietly, not expecting an answer but genuinely puzzled by his serious expression. Williams couldn't respond, of course, but something subtle changed in his posture, not a breaking of discipline, but a softening that suggested he had heard her question and perhaps appreciated its innocence. The child stood there for a moment longer, then returned to her group, seeming to understand instinctively that this was someone deserving of respect. Marcus found himself thinking about his own childhood, his own relationship with duty and responsibility. Growing up in Silicon Valley, he had been taught to question authority, to disrupt traditional systems, to prioritize innovation over tradition. But watching Williams, he began to wonder if something valuable had been lost in that approach. A professional photographer arrived, someone clearly working for a magazine or tourism board. Unlike the casual tourists with their phones, this person understood light and composition, waiting for the right moment to capture images that would do justice to their subjects. Marcus watched as the photographer worked respectfully, never trying to provoke reactions or create artificial moments. When the photographer finished, he approached Marcus, perhaps recognizing a fellow observer. "Remarkable, isn't it?" he said quietly. "I've been photographing the guards for 20 years and I never tire of it. Each one is different, but they all share something special. What do you think that is?" Marcus asked. The photographer considered this carefully. "Purpose," he said finally. "In a world where most people are searching for meaning, these young men have found it. They know exactly why they're here, what they're protecting, what they represent. That kind of certainty is rare these days." Marcus spent the afternoon walking through London's historical sites: Westminster Abbey, the Tower of London, St. Paul's Cathedral. At each location, he encountered more evidence of the continuity Williams represented. These weren't just tourist attractions. They were living monuments to centuries of faith, sacrifice, and commitment. At Westminster Abbey, he stood before the tomb of the unknown warrior, reading the inscription about a soldier whose identity was lost, but whose service was eternal. The parallel to Williams struck him powerfully. Here too was someone who served anonymously, whose individual identity mattered less than what they represented. In the Tower of London, Marcus learned about the yeoman warders, another group of guards who had protected this fortress for centuries. He began to understand that Williams was part of something much larger, a tradition of service that connected the present to the past, that maintained continuity in a rapidly changing world. That evening, Marcus called his parents in California. His mother asked about his travels, expecting stories of famous landmarks and cultural experiences. But Marcus found himself talking about Williams, trying to explain what he had witnessed and why it affected him so deeply. "It sounds like you're learning something important," his father said thoughtfully. "Not everyone gets to see real dedication up close. Most of us go through life without ever encountering someone who truly put service above self." After hanging up, Marcus sat in his hotel room and continued writing in his notebook. He was beginning to realize that this encounter with Williams was changing him in ways he hadn't expected. The guard's silence had spoken to something deep within him, challenging assumptions about strength, purpose, and what it meant to live a meaningful life. He thought about his job back home, his comfortable apartment, his social media accounts full of casual complaints and trivial concerns. None of it seemed important compared to what Williams did every day, standing firm in the face of mockery, maintaining dignity when others showed none, serving something greater than personal comfort or recognition. The weight of British tradition that Marcus had felt was revealing itself to be more than just historical curiosity. It was a living demonstration of values that transcended time and circumstance, embodied by young people like Williams who chose duty over ease, service over self. On his third day watching Williams, Marcus witnessed something that would stay with him forever. A woman in her 70s, clearly American from her accent, approached the guard with a different energy than the typical tourist. She moved slowly, supported by a walking cane, and when she reached Williams, she stopped and stood quietly for several minutes. "My grandson is serving in Afghanistan right now," she said softly, just loud enough for Marcus to hear. "He's about your age. When I see you standing here so proudly, I think of him and all the young people who serve their countries. Thank you." She didn't wait for a response she knew wouldn't come. She simply nodded respectfully and walked away. But Marcus caught something in Williams's eyes that he hadn't seen before. A brief moment of acknowledgement, a flicker of emotion that spoke of shared understanding between those who serve and those who love them. The encounter affected Marcus profoundly. Here was someone who understood what Williams represented, who saw past the uniform and ceremony to the human being underneath. She had recognized the connection between Williams's service at home and her grandson's service abroad, the universal nature of dedication that transcended national boundaries. Later that morning, Marcus overheard two British veterans talking as they watched the guards. They spoke with quiet pride about their own military service, about the traditions they had helped maintain and pass on to the next generation. One of them, a man in his 60s, pointed to Williams. "That boy there, he's got it right," he said. "Understands what it means to serve with honor. Not looking for glory or recognition, just doing his duty because it needs doing." His companion nodded. "Different world from when we served, but the principles remain the same. Stand firm, do your duty, protect what matters." Marcus began to understand that Williams wasn't just an individual performing a ceremonial role. He was part of an unbroken chain of service that connected past, present, and future. Every person who had stood in his position had faced similar challenges: mockery from some, respect from others, the daily choice to maintain dignity regardless of external circumstances. A group of military history students arrived with their professor, and Marcus positioned himself where he could listen to their discussion. The professor spoke knowledgeably about the evolution of the Guard tradition, but what struck Marcus most was her emphasis on the human element. "These ceremonies aren't just about pageantry," she explained to her students. "They're about the continuous commitment of real people to ideals that outlast individual lives. Every Guard who has stood at this post has contributed to something larger than themselves." One student asked why the Guards remained silent, why they didn't engage with the public or explain their role. The professor's answer resonated deeply with Marcus. "Their silence is their strength," she said. "Words can be argued with, debated, dismissed, but their presence, their unwavering commitment speaks louder than any explanation could. They let their actions demonstrate their values rather than trying to convince others through speech." As the afternoon progressed, Marcus noticed other observers like himself, people who had been drawn back day after day, not by the spectacle but by something deeper. A young British woman sat on a nearby bench, sketching Williams with careful attention to detail. An older man stood quietly reading a book about military history while keeping one eye on the Guards. These weren't tourists seeking quick entertainment. They were people who recognized that they were witnessing something rare and valuable, something that connected them to larger themes of duty, honor, and sacrifice. Marcus felt a kinship with these quiet observers, understanding that they too had been affected by the Guard's unwavering presence. When Williams's shift ended, and he was replaced by another Guard, Marcus followed at a respectful distance as the regiment marched away. He wanted to understand where they went, what their lives were like when not on ceremonial duty. He discovered that they returned to Wellington Barracks, where they continued their military training and duties away from public view. Standing outside the barracks, Marcus realized that what tourists saw was only a small part of these soldiers' lives. The ceremony at Buckingham Palace was just the visible expression of a much deeper commitment. These were real soldiers with real training, real responsibilities that extended far beyond standing still for photographs. The weight of tradition that Marcus had initially felt was revealing itself to be carried not by institutions or buildings, but by individuals like Williams who chose to dedicate their lives to service. Each Guard was a living link in a chain that stretched back through centuries, each one adding their own strength to maintain something precious and irreplaceable. That evening, Marcus wrote extensively in his notebook, trying to capture not just what he had observed but how it had changed his own perspective on life, duty, and what it means to find true purpose. Marcus's final day in London arrived too quickly. He had extended his stay twice already, unable to tear himself away from the daily lesson and dedication that Williams provided. This morning felt different, charged with the significance of ending. He arrived earlier than usual, wanting to witness every moment of what might be his last encounter with the Guard who had unknowingly changed his life. Williams was already at his post, as reliable as sunrise. Marcus had learned to read the subtle signs, the slight tension in the Guard's shoulders during busy periods, the imperceptible relaxation when crowds thinned, the way his breathing adjusted to maintain perfect stillness despite physical discomfort. These weren't failures of discipline but evidence of humanity within the dedication. A film crew arrived to document the changing of the Guard for a documentary. Unlike casual tourists, They moved with professional respect, understanding that they were recording something significant. The director, a woman in her 40s, spoke quietly with her camera operator about capturing the dignity and solemnity of the ceremony rather than sensationalizing it. Marcus watched as Williams and his fellow guards maintained their composure despite the additional attention. The cameras didn't make them perform differently or try to appear more impressive. Their commitment remained constant, whether observed by one person or 100, whether filmed for posterity or ignored by passing crowds. During a quiet moment between tourist groups, Marcus noticed a young man about his own age approaching Williams. Unlike the typical visitors, this person wore a military uniform from another country. Canadian, Marcus thought from the maple leaf insignia. The soldier came to attention in front of Williams and offered a sharp salute. The moment was electric with mutual recognition. Though Williams couldn't return the salute while on ceremonial duty, something in his bearing acknowledged the gesture. Two young people from different countries, different military traditions, but united by shared understanding of service and sacrifice. The Canadian soldier held his salute for several seconds before stepping back and walking away. No words necessary. Marcus felt tears in his eyes witnessing this exchange. Here was communication beyond language, respect transcending nationality, understanding that needed no explanation. The visiting soldier had recognized Williams not as a tourist attraction, but as a fellow guardian, someone who had made similar commitments and faced similar challenges. An elderly British couple approached Marcus on his bench, having noticed his daily presence. "You've been watching our guards for days now," the woman said kindly. "What do you see in them that brings you back?" Marcus struggled to articulate what had become clear to him over the past week. "Integrity, I think. Complete commitment to something they believe in, regardless of whether others understand or appreciate it." "I've never seen anything like it," the man nodded thoughtfully. "My father stood guard duty during the war. Different circumstances, of course, but the same dedication. He used to say that someone has to be willing to stand firm when others won't or can't. These young people carry that forward." As the day progressed, Marcus began preparing mentally for departure. His flight was scheduled for the next morning, and his European adventure would continue to other cities, other experiences. But he knew nothing would match what he had learned watching Williams. The afternoon brought one final revelation. A bus arrived carrying visitors from a military academy, young cadets not much younger than Williams himself. They approached the guards with evident respect and discipline, understanding immediately what they were witnessing. Marcus watched as these future officers observed Williams, learning from his example about duty, honor, and silent strength. Their instructor, a senior officer, spoke quietly to his cadets about the tradition they were witnessing. "Notice how they carry themselves," he said. "Not just the physical bearing, but the mental discipline. They represent something larger than themselves, and they never forget that responsibility." One cadet asked why the guards never spoke or acknowledged the crowds. The instructor's response struck Marcus as the perfect summary of what he had learned. "Their silence is their service," the officer explained. "They're not here to entertain or educate or impress anyone. They're here to guard, to stand watch, to maintain their post regardless of external circumstances. Their commitment speaks louder than words ever could." As Williams' shift neared its end, Marcus felt the weight of impending farewell. This anonymous guard had taught him more about character, purpose, and dedication than years of formal education. Williams had shown him what it looked like to live with absolute commitment to something beyond personal comfort or recognition. The changing of the guard proceeded with the same precision Marcus had witnessed on his first day, but now he understood its deeper significance. This wasn't just ceremony or tradition. It was the physical manifestation of values that transcended time and circumstance. Each guard who took Williams's place was accepting the same sacred trust, promising the same unwavering dedication. Walking away from Buckingham Palace for the last time, Marcus carried with him a transformed understanding of strength, service, and what it means to find true purpose in life. The weight of British tradition that had initially silenced him with its immensity now inspired him with its accessibility. Anyone could choose dedication. Anyone could commit to something greater than themselves. Anyone could stand firm in the face of mockery or indifference. 6 months later, Marcus sat in his apartment in San Francisco, staring at the notebook filled with observations from his time watching Williams. The pages were worn from frequent reading, the margins filled with additional thoughts and insights that had occurred to him in the months since returning home. His life had changed in ways both subtle and profound. At work, he found himself approaching problems with Williams's patient dedication, rather than his previous impatience for quick results. When colleagues complained about difficult clients or challenging projects, Marcus thought of the guard standing motionless while teenagers mocked him, maintaining dignity regardless of external pressures. He had started volunteering at a local veterans center, drawn by his new understanding of service and sacrifice. The elderly men and women he met there reminded him of the British grandmother who had thanked Williams for his service. People who understood what it meant to dedicate oneself to something greater than personal comfort. Marcus had also made changes in his personal relationships, inspired by Williams's example of quiet strength. Instead of always needing to have the last word in arguments, he learned the power of thoughtful silence. He discovered that listening often accomplished more than speaking, that presence could be more powerful than words. The notebook lay open to a page where Marcus had written, "True strength isn't about forcing others to acknowledge you. It's about maintaining your principles regardless of whether anyone notices or cares." Below that, in different ink, he had added months later, "Williams taught me that service isn't about recognition. It's about commitment to something worth protecting." His friends noticed the changes in Marcus, though they couldn't always identify what was different. He seemed more grounded, more purposeful, less concerned with impressing others or seeking validation. Some asked about his travels, expecting stories of famous landmarks and cultural experiences, but Marcus found it difficult to explain how watching one silent guard had transformed his understanding of life itself. The photograph he had finally taken on his last day, a respectful, distant shot of Williams at his post, sat framed on his desk, not as a trophy or tourist souvenir, but as a daily reminder of the principles he had witnessed. Sometimes colleagues would ask about the picture, and Marcus would simply say it represented someone who had taught him about dedication. Marcus had researched the Guard Regiment extensively since returning home, learning about their history, their training, their role in British military tradition. But all the historical facts paled beside his personal experience of witnessing one individual's commitment to duty. He had written several letters to Williams, though he never sent them. How could he explain to a stranger that their silent example had changed another person's life? How could he thank someone for teaching lessons they hadn't meant to give? Instead, Marcus tried to honor what he had learned by living it, by becoming someone worthy of the example Williams had provided. The notebook also contained drafts of a story Marcus was writing about his experience, not for publication but for his own understanding, trying to capture what he had witnessed and why it mattered. Each draft revealed new layers of meaning, new connections between Williams's silent service and the larger questions about purpose, duty, and what it means to live with integrity. Marcus had planned to return to London the following summer, partly hoping to see Williams again, partly wanting to visit other places where similar traditions continued. But he realized that the real value of his experience wasn't in the specific person or location. It was in the principles Williams embodied that could be found anywhere, in any service member, in anyone who chose commitment over convenience. On quiet evenings, Marcus would sometimes sit with his notebook and remember that rainy morning when he first encountered Williams's unwavering presence. The tourist in him had expected entertainment, spectacle, something to photograph and share. Instead, he had discovered something far more valuable, a living example of what it meant to serve with honor, to stand firm in one's convictions, to find meaning and dedication to something greater than oneself. The weight of British tradition that had initially silenced Marcus with its grandeur had become a source of inspiration rather than intimidation. He understood now that tradition wasn't about the past. It was about eternal principles carried forward by individuals who chose to embody them. Williams hadn't just been representing centuries of history. He had been creating it, adding his own thread to an unbroken pattern of service and sacrifice. Marcus closed the notebook and looked out at the San Francisco skyline, thinking about all the people in the city below who were searching for meaning, for purpose, for something worth dedicating their lives to. He wished they could all have witnessed what he had seen. One young man standing perfectly still, wordlessly demonstrating that true strength comes not from seeking attention, but from unwavering commitment to duty, regardless of whether anyone understands or appreciates the sacrifice involved. The silent guardian had spoken volumes without saying a word, and Marcus would carry that lesson for the rest of his life.